The Nile has to be one of the most easily recognized rivers in the world. Whenever it's mentioned, you can't help but think of the great Egyptian civilization that came to be around 5,000 years ago. This river is not just the longest in the world at 6,800 kilometers in length, but it's also quite possibly the most important and influential river that has ever existed. Sure, there's the Amazon River in South America, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that flow through Iraq, Syria and Turkey, and also the Yellow River in China. And while these rivers have been the cradle of great civilizations, none of them is quite as important as the Nile River. The Nile, when you look at the lands it flows through, is the only source of reliable and drinkable water for Egypt. Go further south and it's the only source of reliable and drinkable water for both North and South Sudan. Go even further down and you will see that the Nile flows through multiple other countries before it gets to Egypt. Before its source was discovered in 1858 by John Hanning Speke, the people in Egypt that lived and died by its shores didn't know where it came from. Well, saying they didn't know where it came from would be quite unfair. They obviously knew it flowed from the south, but any attempts to find a true source always stopped at the impenetrable swampland in Sudan called the Sud. When it was discovered in 1858 that Lake Victoria was its source, Egypt became very worried. To understand this, we need to understand the Nile itself. The Nile isn't just the Nile. The Nile is actually two Niles. First, there's the White Nile, which starts from Lake Victoria, then passes through Uganda, then through South Sudan, and then into North Sudan. Then there's the Blue Nile, which flows from the highlands of Ethiopia. The fertile soil that comes with the Nile originates from this particular Nile. This is because there's a rift system splitting that section of the continent apart. And as with all rift systems, there's a lot of volcanic material created, which is then broken down into rich and fertile volcanic soil by either rain or wind. Because the Nile passes through so many countries, and especially because the two Niles converge in Khartoum, Egypt had no choice but to try to make sure it wouldn't be used too much by these other countries when one of its sources was discovered in 1858. You see, the Nile is the lifeline of Egypt itself. Almost all of Egypt's cities lie along it or within its delta. Cities like Aswan, Luxor, Gena, Mansoura and Cairo all rely on its flow. If the Nile were to suddenly be used too much by the Sudans, Ethiopia or even Uganda, there simply wouldn't be enough water to support the demands of these modern cities. This is why Egypt has engaged in multiple treaties since the early 1900s to prevent its lifeline from being shared. There was the 1929 treaty it signed with Great Britain to grant it the power to veto the construction of dams on either the White or Blue Nile. And then there was the Nile Water Agreement signed in 1959 between Egypt and Sudan after Egypt was granted complete independence in 1953. Under this treaty, the annual flow of the Nile was split between the two countries, 80% for Egypt and 20% for Sudan. Except the Nile doesn't originate from these two countries, it simply flows through them. Other Nile basin countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda and Ethiopia weren't included in these agreements, and so to them, they don't really need to follow whatever Egypt or Sudan say they can do with the Nile. They themselves need it to modernize, and this means they need to construct dams on it just like Egypt did with the Aswan Dam in the 1960s, which allowed it to engage in massive irrigation projects. Sudan also constructed the Merowe Dam in 2004 and opened it in 2009 to do exactly what Egypt did. And so Ethiopia, Uganda and other Nile basin countries want to do exactly the same. This means the 80% and 20% annual flow in the 1959 Nile Water Agreement would need to be revised, which is exactly what Egypt and Sudan don't want to do. To both of these countries, they've earned the waters of the Nile through the agreement, and Egypt in particular feels a greater sense of entitlement to its flow since its entire culture and way of life has depended on the Nile for the past 5,000 years. Despite Egypt's attempts, the fact still remains that the Nile is neither Egypt's or Sudan's. If anything, the waters of the Nile belongs to Ethiopia and Tanzania. After all, 85% of the Nile's waters comes from the Blue Nile, which originates from Ethiopia, and the remaining 15% comes from the White Nile, which has its source from Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda's Great Lake Victoria. The Nile is the most important and influential river in the world because how it will be used in the future will have a tremendous effect on Egypt as a country. Without the Nile's consistent flow, Egypt will not be able to meet its water demands, and this will mean a massive decline in Egypt's cultural, economic, and international power. And these are three things any country, and Egypt in particular, is willing to fight to keep.